With the recent launch of the uber powerful GPD Win 5, how are two of their older machines holding up? Let's find out. Welcome to Esk Computers, I'm Scott, and today on the desk of Esk, I admit that I have a problem with handheld devices. Primarily, where to store them, and this is after having sold the likes of the Open Pandora and my patient zero for this nonsense, the venerable GP32. Who else remembers smart media cards? I am an old man. Anyway, my idea for this video was to chart how GPD's Windows handhelds have improved from the low-powered 2016 original through to its Steam-adjacent Win 3 of 2021, and their most recent absolute unit, the GPD Win 5, with the integrated 8060 graphics that should be more powerful than a lot of the discrete graphics cards that we've seen on the channel. But with high power comes a high price tag that is way beyond what I can scrape together. Maybe we can revisit this in a decade or so. So, we're going to look at the models that mere mortals can afford, with the original Win going for about £160 on eBay, and the Win 3 varying between £200 and £300, although neither pop up very frequently to be fair, so it's very changeable. Let's take a look at the first outing. The OG GPD Win has a clamshell design that, if memory serves, is roughly the same size as the original versions of the Nintendo DS or 3DS, although a bit bulkier than my DS Lite. It opens to reveal a 5.5-inch 720p touchscreen. It's a decent IPS, and because it's so small, the 1280x720 resolution looks sharp on it. Unfortunately, because it's so small, it's difficult to use as a Windows desktop, particularly as my eyesight continues to degrade. Have I mentioned I'm an old man? Looking down, we see that this is clearly for tech gamers, with dual analog sticks, or I suppose sliders might be closer to the mark, a serviceable D-pad, 4 face buttons that are joined by digital shoulder buttons and triggers, start and select buttons, and a keyboard. Now, in the keyboard's defence, I'm not sure there's a much better way to execute this idea, given the space available. By having to comply with the laws of physics, this is by nature cramped and only suitable for poking at. To further defend it, that's all that it was ever intended for, entering passwords and naming your character and whatnot. It's not supposed to be a primary control method, or for typing out a novel, so I suppose that it does what it needs to do, even if it is awful. Better than an Xbox chat pad, I guess. Thankfully it's a bit better as a joypad, not as good as a proper controller of course, but this also has to fit a computer in the same footprint. The D-pad, buttons and triggers are all fine, a little spongy for my tastes and have been improved on in further iterations. The sticks take a bit of getting used to, but if you could live with the PlayStation Portable's analog implementation, then this is a good bit better. These sticks are not clickable and are instead assigned to these L3 and R3 buttons, which can be a bit of a pain in some games. Completing the external survey, there's a USB-C port that also charges the 6700 mAh battery, a USB 3 Type A port, mini HDMI output, a micro SD expansion slot, and a combined 3.5mm headphone and microphone jack that saves you from the integrated speaker that's not great even considering its diminutive size. There's also a fan control switch on the back, allowing a choice of silent, loud, and unbearable. It's the pitch more than the volume that annoys. This switch here is a critical innovation from GPD. It essentially swaps between the controller acting as, well, a controller, and emulating a mouse. It's not a perfect solution, as of course you can be nowhere near as accurate on a joystick as you can with a mouse, but it's just about good enough to allow navigating windows without resorting to the touchscreen, which is not much better for general use given how small the touch targets are on a 5.5-inch screen. Maybe that Windows 8 UI doesn't seem like such a bad idea after all. This is powered by an Intel Atom X7Z8750, a 4-core non-hyper-threaded part that draws count them, 2 watts, while bursting up to 2.56 GHz from its base of 1.6 GHz. That processor has the legendarily bad, Intel HD integrated graphics, which will clock between 200 and 600 MHz. Combined with 4 gigs of LPDDR3 1600 RAM and 64 GB of slow eMMC storage, this is obviously not a performance powerhouse, now or then. The flip side of it not being too powerful is that the battery life can be better. I'd replaced the battery in this back in 2019, so it's probably degraded by now, but it still gets about an hour and a half to 2 hours of battery life at heavy load, which isn't too bad. Windows itself is part of the problem with this machine, and it's also the same for the Win 3. Even stripped back and debloated, it takes up a fair amount of computing resource to run, and even with GPD's accommodations, it just isn't designed to be used with a control pad. I'm probably not doing it any favours with the stripped back Windows 11 install, but it's not really running any worse than the default Windows 10 install was. Given all that, it's almost surprising that it can do anything, really, but it has its moments. I will spare both you and me the usual suite of modern games performance testing. Obviously, that's well beyond it. I did manage in the past to complete a playthrough of Fallout 3 at the lowest settings possible with a bit of help from High Algo Boost, which kind of filled the gap that LSFG does these days. It's hardly the optimal way to play, but it is possible. Without it, as seen here, it's bouncing about between 30 odd FPS in smaller maps like Megaton, or 20 odd outside in the capital wastelands. In fact, I think for a certain kind of nerd, and if you're watching this, YouTube thinks you are a nerd, sorry, most of the fun to be had with this was optimising and feature cutting games to within an inch of their lives to get them running in a halfway playable state. It's at least in part how the Fox made his mark on YouTube. It would be more comfortable with older games, although unfortunately, the age of the games that this can play well coincide with those that are old enough to be a complete pain to get working under modern versions of Windows. Here's Deus Ex, refusing point blank to run in full screen mode, but at least it's playable if you squint at it. The win is not helped by this non-standard screen that's designed for phone use, so it natively defaults to being portrait orientation, not horizontal. For example, here's Max Payne, whose intros videos work as expected, but the game itself is tilted sideways and cropped. A lot of the time that's fixable by finding modified old versions of DirectX DLLs, but it's a lot of tinkering and certainly worlds away from a console-like experience, even if you can still find them amongst the bit rot of dead links. Where it can still provide value is the realms of 2D games, the vast bulk of which will run well, and to a degree the emulation of earlier, less demanding consoles. I have played a great deal of Spelunky on this little gadget, and it's able to emulate all of the classic 16-bit systems up to the Neo Geo without missing a beat. It's also happy enough with the original PlayStation emulation, but beyond that's maybe a bit of a struggle. It also makes for a passable Steam Link device for remote play. Of course, this is a Windows machine and can do the usual Windowsy things like web browsing and office tasks, and it handles that okay if you're patient, but it's only practical if you can hook it up to an external monitor, keyboard and mouse, which kinda defeats the purpose of a portable machine. Now, I liked, and continue to like, this machine enough that I've not considered selling it since buying it from new for £235 back in 2017. However, I can't really give you much of a use case for it in space year 2026. They don't show up on eBay often enough to establish an average price really, but there's been a few sold recently at £160, and I think you're going to have some very clear use cases and a need for this form factor or Windows for that to be a good value proposition. Pretty much anything that this can emulate can be done better by a dedicated emulation handheld, or indeed your phone with a USB controller, and a good amount of the 2D and indie games that work well have Switch, Android or iOS versions by this point. Indeed, if you have a higher end phone from the past couple of years, it can probably emulate Windows better than this runs it natively. The OG GPD Win was a reasonably priced novelty item for inveterate hobbyist tinkerers to experiment with, and I've certainly had my money's worth from it. However, in 2026, this is relegated to sitting on a shelf as a piece of nostalgia, and I can't see much use for it apart from as a historical curio for appreciators of this little corner of handheld PCs. GPD continued experimenting with a direct sequel in the similarly styled and low-powered Win 2, while expanding the line into the more laptop or netbook styled but still diminutive Win Max. The GPD Win 3 released in 2021, with this faster i7 model costing $900 at launch, although I didn't get mine until October 2024 used, by which point it was apparently going for £220. It's a very different beast, which you can see just by looking at it. Externals first, and clearly this is no longer a clamshell, and takes what I guessed the youth of today would call a Nintendo Switch format, while the screen remains at 5.5 inches and 720p. This one slides. Doing so reveals where that keyboard's been hiding. This is an, I assume, flat capacitive grid that takes up less internal volume than the OG Win's membrane setup and has a little more space to play with, which should make it better, but the complete lack of feedback makes this an awful typing experience. But again, it's for passwords and naming your character, not writing War and Peace. We get much better analog sticks with R3 L3 clicks this time, and a more PlayStation style D-pad, which I actually don't like as much, but it still works well enough. The face buttons feel smaller and clickier, for want of a better term, and the L2 R2 triggers are now analog, so much more useful. There's also two programmable buttons on the back grips, which I'd completely forgotten about, as they're in, for me at least, in an extremely awkward position that I just can't stretch to while in normal use. It weighs about 600 grams when it's added to this, I think, silicone grip case, which I swing back and forward on whether it's actually better than just going with it naked. The fingerprint scanner appears to be incompatible with my hands, as I've never had much success with what ought to be a useful addition for logging on. We get a Type-C port that's Thunderbolt 4 compatible and a Type-A port. Thankfully, we still have the headphone mic combo jack, as the new dual speakers are better than the Win 1 but still not brilliant. Also returning is the micro SD card slot, much appreciated, although as this has a 1TB internal SSD, it's not needed quite so badly. This model has the i7-1165G7, a 2.8 GHz 4-core 8-thread part that turbos up to 4.7 GHz with a TDP of up to 28 watts, although by default here it's limited to 20 watts, which can be tweaked up or down in the BIOS. So it's roughly an order of magnitude faster than a Win 1, although at the cost of using an order of magnitude more power draw from the battery. That processor has the integrated Iris Xe graphics G7 with 96 execution units and is paired with 16 gigs of LPDDR4X RAM at 4266 MHz. It shipped with Windows 10, but I've since installed the GPD provided Windows 11 image from their site for better or worse. Mostly worse. From reviews at the time of launch, battery life wasn't amazing, and my 4-year-old one is even worse, getting something like 45 minutes of gameplay on more demanding titles before folding. This iteration of the Win is modern enough, and I think powerful enough, to at least give the usual battery of tests a go, so let's see if it can beat out my old laptop's Ryzen 5 2500U Vega 8 APU. I think it goes without saying that this, when hooked up to a keyboard, mouse and monitor, can do all the usual office stuff, audio editing, photo editing, that kind of thing with ease. This was a fairly high-end laptop processor a few years ago, and a setup like this could comfortably serve the vast bulk of people's computing needs. Out of curiosity, I ran that DaVinci Resolve project render that I've been using as a test, and it completes in 12 minutes and 56 seconds, so it's approximately twice as fast as my laptop, and about the same as the Mac Pro 2013, although of course editing without a larger external screen would be difficult. Cinebench 2024 gets a pretty good single-core result of 79, much stronger than the V4 Xeons we've looked at, but not quite as strong as the Ryzen 5000 series chips. The multi-core result of 209 seems oddly low, but that's what retesting yields. I think the power and cooling setup is limiting this. In the synthetic graphics benchmarks, TimeSpy gets 1291, Firestrike scores 3889, and Superposition gets 1883 at 1080p settings, which are results about 50, 80 and 90% faster than my laptop respectively, so it's looking positive for the gaming tests. I'm going to test these games plugged into power and a monitor at 1080p to directly compare with the beefier systems that I've looked at on the channel, and then at the 720p native resolution of the screen to reflect some more real-world performance. I should note that a lot of these captures at 720p you'll see look pretty good on a 5-inch screen, but abysmal on a large 4K monitor, so bear that in mind. Shadow of the Tomb Raider gets 15 average FPS at 1080p settings, but a playable 30 average FPS at 720p low. Counter-Strike 2 can only reach 17 average FPS at 1080p very high, but again a very playable 49 average FPS at 720p low. Cyberpunk 2077 won't count in its running with ray tracing of course, but gets 12 average FPS at the unrealistic 1080p ultra settings, but again some just about playable results at 720p with 30 average FPS at Steam Deck settings, or 37 average FPS at low settings with ultra performance XeSS enabled. In Unreal Engine 5 games, Marvel Rivals would not launch due to it claiming DirectX 12 wasn't fully supported, although Black Myth Wukong had no such qualms. At 6 average FPS at 1080p high and no frame gen, perhaps it shouldn't have bothered. Throwing the kitchen sink of trickery at it, we can get up to 22 average FPS at 720p low settings, 66% FSR resolution upscaling, and with frame gen, pushing it up to a whole 31 average FPS if we drop to 33% resolution scaling, although it's more impressionist painting than game at this point. Assassin's Creed Mirage can get 16 average FPS at 1080p low, with a sort of playable 29 average FPS at 720p with adaptive XeSS upscaling. Forza Horizon 5 did give me a 22 average FPS at 1080p low settings, but then it stopped working and I couldn't figure out why. C'est la vie. Rounding off the usual suspects, Red Dead Redemption 2 at 720p low settings gives an entirely acceptable 48 average FPS on the benchmark run. What all of this proves is that while it's clearly not intended to run some of the heaviest, most graphically demanding games, it's got just enough horsepower to make an attempt, if the game engine can beat it halfway. Not the optimal way to play for sure, but it's arguably getting into PlayStation 4 power level territory. Speaking of, I've not tested the emulation capabilities this time round, but this is obviously capable of a wider range of emulation than the OG Win, handling PS2 easily enough, and takes a pretty good stab at PS3 and Nintendo Wii U and Switch games. So it's a massive jump from the OG Win, but it's still not going to be cranking at 120 FPS on the newest games. However, let's not underplay the improvement in capabilities. It's gone from barely playing Fallout 3 to easily handling Fallout 4, a console generational improvement. There's a huge amount of gaming that can be done in this, such as Fallout 4 here, running at 720p low settings and getting around 54 average FPS. Throwing some more appropriate games at it, all of these being at the 720p native resolution of the screen, here's Batman Arkham City at medium settings holding 60 average FPS. Mass Effect, the original release at highest settings, gets 57 average FPS, and I'm sure it could handle the more recent Legendary Edition as well. Here's Skyrim, the original release, at high settings getting 59 average FPS. A remaster this time with GTA 5's Enhanced Edition at high settings getting 42 average FPS, and I expect this could be tweaked if you need closer to 60, or you could of course go back to the standard edition. Max Payne 3 was the only disappointment, at low settings only getting an average of 29 FPS. I think this is because I was not able to bump it out of DirectX 9 mode into DirectX 11, and the Intel drivers generally don't work so well with the older APIs, probably fixable with more effort. Street Fighter V has a low spec mode which easily gives 60 FPS at the cost of being as ugly as sin, so much better option is to use the high settings, which also gets 60 FPS. The Witcher 3 at Steam Deck settings gives us a 56 average FPS out here in the countryside, and I expect the frame rate in cities to drop a bit, but this is still pretty good performance. I've most recently been using this to try and get into Baldur's Gate 3, a demanding game that doesn't run amazingly well, but it's also the sort of game that doesn't demand high frame rates to enjoy the convenience and flexibility that's afforded by portability, and that more than outweighs some choppy graphics. At 720p low, this is getting 40ish FPS with some extreme dips, but that's fine for this sort of game. I've also been playing a lot of Black Mesa, which is still using the original Half-Life source engine, if you can believe it. It looks pretty nice on a Win 3, with this being the 720p high setting, where it's getting anywhere between 50 and 120 FPS depending on the map. This is kind of how I remember Half-Life looking through my rose-tinted memories, but Black Mesa is such a great visual overhaul and is highly recommended. So in terms of value, there's not really enough of these on eBay to give you a good price guide, but the recently sold ones seem to be going for more like £300-ish used, which is getting into used LCD Steam Deck or Legion OS territory, which are more powerful by virtue of being newer. Steam OS in particular is a better fit for a gaming machine in terms of usability, at the cost of not being able to play some games with the more aggressive anti-cheat software. I'll get to my thoughts on the Steam Deck in time, no doubt, but if I were to start downsizing these machines for whatever reason, I'd be more likely to keep the deck. But I'd definitely be sad about getting rid of this, and my main issue with both GPD devices is that my eyesight's getting worse to the point that the 5.5-inch screen is hard for me to use with any comfort. Before this surrender to Father Time's ocular assault, I was very happy with this, and at £220 it was an absolute steal. If you have sharper eyes and can find one in that price range, I'd jump on it. As for me, well, join me in my next video where I bolt an Xbox controller onto a 16-inch laptop to create a large print Steam Deck for bats. But until then, take care of yourself and each other.